Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Get Into It with Gila. I'm Gila Glassberg, your host, registered dietitian, and intuitive eating counselor. And today I have on Bracha Poliakoff. Bracha, hi, how are you?
Sheila,
Thank you so much for coming on. This is so nice to have you.
thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. Where do you live and what do you do?
So I live in Baltimore. Professionally, I'm a mental health professional. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I was a therapist for a short time. I've done a lot of things in the social work mental health field. But in the last few years, I've moved really into the more the education and advocacy side of things. And so professionally, I have a business. It's called Bright Ideas Continuing Education. And we do trainings for social workers, mental health professionals, continuing education, professional development, things like that. And then I also wrote a book recently. It's called Reclaiming Dignity, A Guide to Tzniut for Men and Women. So that's been a big project. And then besides for those two things that take up most of my time, I'm very busy with other things, including, my family, life, but also other community projects that I've been involved with over the years. Just trying to, make a little difference in my corner of the world. So
Yeah, that's amazing. Where are you originally from?
I moved to Baltimore when I was 6 from New York. So
Oh,
I've lived here for a while with a break of 3 years where my husband and I lived in Richmond, Virginia.
very nice. Very, very nice. And did you always know you wanted to be a therapist?
No, I'm like I'm what they call a multi-potentialite. I don't know if you've heard that
I
word
never heard
before.
that word, but I can
Um,
understand what it
I
means.
like to do a little bit of everything. So I went through a stage like starting, I would say end of high. I mean, obviously, when you're a kid, like every day someone says, "What do you want to be when you grow up?"
Yeah.
And you're always like changing your mind.
Yeah.
So I
Yes.
went through like 500 different things throughout school. And then even when I was like finishing up high school, I still had like 20 different ideas. And then in seminary, my father, he used to call me and say, like, what's your major going to be? You need to sign up for college. And I would like every 2 weeks it was something different. So I ended up doing a bachelor's in psychology and social work, but I don't know. I still feel like that sometimes. Like every day I want to do something a little different. And
Yeah.
I pretty much every year I kind of try something a little new, even if it's not like a full-time thing. Like
Yeah.
2 years ago as a professor for a year.
That's so
Um,
cool.
so I just do different things,
Yeah.
keeps
Yeah. I'm
life
the same way.
exciting.
I'm the same way. I don't like
Yeah.
staying in one area. I like
Yeah, I can't.
every area, like especially social work, even nutrition, like it kind of could go in many different directions. So it makes
Yeah,
sense.
that's the great thing about social work. It's like there's so much flexibility.
Yeah.
So even within that field, like I've done so many different things, and each thing I've learned so much and like brought those skills and experience into the next thing, and it's
Yeah.
very cool.
So you started your own business?
Yeah, so 10 years ago, I started this continuing education business
Wow.
because, if you have a license, you probably have
Yeah.
the same thing. You have to
Yeah.
take continuing education.
Yeah.
So I started it as kind of like a side gig, and then during COVID, I was working part-time also somewhere else as a social worker. And during COVID, I was furloughed from my job because I worked with seniors, and obviously
Yeah.
they didn't want us in person at that time, right at the beginning of COVID. So I shifted gears and ended up doing a lot of the trainings on Zoom and just doing the business full time.
Wow. That's awesome. That's so cool. And when you say like you do like advocacy, what does that look like?
I think it's more like just education to the community, education to, social workers. Like if there's something I think is really missing from people's education, that's something I'll focus on. Um,
So nice. So I want to talk a little bit. I want to touch on two things. One is maybe like our overlapping passion for like educating the public on like let's say intuitive eating or health at every size or whatever you want to
sure.
call it. But I also really want to talk about your book, Reclaiming Dignity. Although I did not read it yet, it's on my to read list. But I also heard you on DMC, right? And I heard so I understood like the gist of the book, but if you don't mind sharing, like how did that come to be that you wrote that book?
Yeah. So basically, the way the book came to be was that since the time I was pretty young, SNES is something I just struggled to connect with, like the whole, not in a practical way, just the whole concept of it, like I struggled with for different reasons. And over the years, like I would see different things about SNES, like books or articles or shiurim, different things. And I just like really really didn't connect with them. And I realized like if I'm feeling that way, there's probably a lot of people that are struggling in this area. And so like over the years, I kept waiting for someone to like put out a book. Like I kind of had this radar out there, like this is something that the community needs, but obviously like I'm not going to do it. So I was kind of waiting for someone else to do it
Yeah.
for a very long time. And then finally like something happened and I'm like, you know what? I just have to like do it myself. Like I have to figure out how to do this. So I reached out to a lot of people and said like, I have this idea for this book. There's such a need. Do you want to do it? And I'll like help behind the scenes. Like I'll fundraise. I didn't even know what was involved. I was just like, I'll help, but I don't know how it'll look. But like I'll be involved, but you'll write it. And I reached out to a bunch of different people who I thought were kind of in this space or had good ideas about it. And um, they were all too busy and they all thought it was a great idea. They just didn't want to do it themselves.
Right.
And so finally, one of the people I reached out to was actually Rabbi Anthony Manning because he had a couple audio shiurim on the topic that I really enjoyed. And so I reached out to him also, and he was just also really busy. I think it was like right before either right before COVID, right when COVID started, and he would just also like just couldn't do it. So I was kind of stuck because at that point, like everyone had said no, but at that point I was already pretty excited about the project and I felt like it was really needed. So I just was like, you know what, I'm as a summer project, I'm just gonna start like working on it. I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I'm just gonna start like typing something up. I don't know. So I reached back out to Rabbi Manning and said to him, you know, I reached out to you a while ago about this book. Um, I know you don't have time to do it, but is it okay if I use some of your sources? And obviously I'll, credit you. And he said, well, you know what, let's have a conversation because there's a chance I might be able to help. And that's how the book started.
Wow. So you've never written, that's the only book you've written. Are you a writer in
Well,
general? You
I
wrote
do.
a bunch of
I
books.
actually wrote a different book, but nobody knows about it. When I was very, very young, it's called, let's see if I can remember what it's called. I have it here. It's called How to Make the Most of Your Year in Israel, I think it's called. But it was just printed, we only printed like a few hundred copies. It wasn't like a very,
Okay, that's a big deal.
yeah, so that was like the first time I did something like this, but on a very, very, very small scale. And it was a very small little book. Um,
That was about your year in Israel.
it was how to make the most of your year in Israel, like for
Was it
students
based
going
on
to
your year?
seminary. Yeah, it was based on experience, based on different things like put together, speaking to people. Yeah,
Okay, so I can see that that's kind of like your thing. Like you see like there's like I got just so you know, I have this like great idea for a book that I haven't formulated yet in my head, but I really would love to write it.
okay, let's
Um,
talk after this.
okay. I already started writing it, so I do actually have a lot of
That's awesome.
yeah. But it's so hard. It's such a hard I love to write. I actually have a blog. I write a lot. But
Amazing.
writing like a cohesive, like longer book is harder for me because it's like you have to like why is a book ever more than one chapter, right? Because like people are building on the concepts and there's like a certain order and structure that you're trying to get a message across. I find that really, really, really hard.
Yeah.
The fact that you actually did it is like really, really huge. And I think a lot of people could relate to the fact that like, CS is such a big topic. Like it's such a gigantic topic. Like there's so many levels and there's so many layers to it. So like it's and people like I've often heard people say like, oh, it's a share on sneeze. Like I'm not gonna go to that. Like just so much like not just negativity, just like a lot of emotions when it comes to sneeze. And it is a loaded
Yeah.
topic. So it makes sense why it would, I guess that's like they say that about like the Sahara, like the bigger like the potential for Kadisha, the bigger potential for, the opposite of Kadisha. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like,
I think it's partly that and partly just people's like educational experiences that they're just like kind of burned out, like they're
yeah,
like, okay, either they're like, I don't like this topic, or they find it like these type of classes judgmental or
yeah,
off-putting in some way, or it's like they're like, oh, I already know everything, I already do everything, like I don't need it, so it's
yeah,
like either way, I feel like it's very hard for a lot of people struggle with that. And I've even noticed like in recent years, a lot of these like organizations or people, they'll put like a talk on SNES, but they'll call it something else.
yeah,
Like they'll be like an evening of inspiration and like it's really
right.
like
Yeah, yeah,
vague, And I think
yeah,
that really just speaks to the issue. It's like if we can't say an evening about SNES or right, we can't use the word,
yeah.
what are we doing? Like what are we doing wrong that we have to like dance around it so much?
Could you I mean, you don't have to share, but could you share like what was like your biggest like not I guess motivator? Like what was so like a like what did you have such a hard time connecting with CNS?
For me, a lot of it was just, it felt very like the way I like heard about it in the past. A lot of times it was like with a lot of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of like, it was very confusing to me. Like it would be taught in a way that didn't seem like true, I guess. Like there would be like a lot of things explained, then I would like learn the actual sources. That's not what they said, or like there was things that were really minhag, but they would say, it's like a custom, and they would describe it and say, describe it as if it was like written directly in the Torah, or it's like a very important halacha, and it's like this is a minhag that maybe only one community does, and we're saying everybody should like. It was just very confusing and a lot of like judgment mixed in with that. And just I think for me, and maybe this, this definitely connects to also those intuitive eating and health at every size and all of that too, is just like the extreme emphasis on externals, right? Like that everything is
Yeah.
about what people look like, how they dress, every detail of how they dress, down to like the millimeter and the color and it's like it was just getting like to this point where I'm like, I don't want to hear about it anymore,
Right.
like
Yeah.
why are we so focused? And it's funny to say that as someone who just wrote a book on the topic,
Right.
right? And that's the
Right.
whole point is it is about this topic, but shifting the focus,
Right.
because I think that was the part that was hard for me, was the way that it was being framed and discussed and the language being used, and like the fact that it was all about externals,
Yeah.
when like really when you learn the actual Torah and the actual sources, it's like the exact opposite. It's
Right.
so much about internals, right?
Right. Right.
So
And then
like
it's like the attitude of stance as opposed to the halachic rulings of stance, let's say.
So, I mean, there is halachas of sneas, but there's a whole idea of sneas beyond that.
Right.
And even the halachas, people don't really understand where they come from. There's a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of confusion and
Right.
misconceptions, honestly. But
Right.
at the core of it, when you actually learn like what Chazal say, it's all based on this internal piece.
Right.
And I think that was something that, like, even as a teenager, like, and a young adult, I picked up on that. Like, something's just missing here. Like, it wasn't landing right, you know?
No, I totally understand. And I really appreciate that the tie-in to intuitive eating and health at every size. And what I think why like for some people in the specifically in the Orthodox world, we have such a hard time with like diet culture because it's like so antithetical to Jewish values. Like, like I can't say this enough times. I don't mean like don't care about what you look like and don't care about how you eat and don't care about how you exercise. I don't ever mean that. I mean like those things are important and they're like an ends to a mean a means to an end, not a end in and of itself, right? So it's like sneeze, you could think of it the same way. Like,
Exactly.
so like for somebody who, especially like for people who are more internal by nature, and I'm assuming that you would fall into that category, it's like, what are we
Right.
doing?
I don't know. I don't know if I go that far, but I try.
But obviously something that like aligns with your like true core values, that like it would upset you so much even as a teenager, you know? So how did the book get received in the firm world?
So the book has been incredibly well received, like way beyond my dream, like anything I imagined. And I barely even had any like idea, because when I first pitched this idea, I remember I had a Zoom meeting with Rabbi Manning, who ended up becoming my co-author on the book. And I literally said to him on the Zoom meeting, like, I have no idea if this book's gonna sell more than like two copies, because there's a lot of women in my world, at least, like people I meet, that say, I'm never going to read a book on that topic, you
Yeah.
know?
Hmm.
So Kobe would put this book out, and people walk in the store and see a book on stance and just walk right by and like whatever. But I said to him, like, I'm writing this book so that when you go in the store, if there is someone out there anywhere in the world and she or he wants to learn about this topic, that there's just one book on the bookshelf that is more balanced and has a more nuanced perspective, and is something like, I really just wrote it for myself, honestly, like for
Well,
me, that
you
if
had
I
to,
would go in the store,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
that there would be a book that I could connect to, that I could relate to, that would help me in my own journey. And I really said that to him. I was like, it could be, I'll sell three copies, like, and that'll be good, because like that's my goal. Like, I didn't have like a goal much bigger than that. Now my goal's shifted a little bit, now that I'm seeing how well it's
Yeah,
doing. Now I'm like, okay, we got to change the world,
yeah,
completely
yeah,
change how everyone talks about this topic.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, at the time it was like very low key. And thank God the book has actually sold out. We're on our fifth printing now.
Wow. How
So
many
yeah,
books does that mean that you
so
sold?
so every printing was a little bit it's hard to actually count, because every printing was a little bit of a different size. I think it was around 6,000 total. I think.
crazy.
So in the frum world, that's like a big
That's
deal.
huge in the firm world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give me one second. I'm just gonna grab some water.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, sure. No problem. So you sold about 6,000 copies, which is really big in the firm world.
Yeah.
And what has the feedback been?
I mean, the feedback has been incredible, unreal. Just as far as number one, the reach of the book, like the different types of communities, different types of people that are reading it, and just how much it's impacting them. Like I have someone reached out to me, they're teaching a college class based on the book. Someone else reached out to me, like there's a journal, I don't know if you're familiar, Tradition Journal,
No.
tradition Jewish thought, like multiple essays recently like referenced the book. Like it's just there was I think like 10 reviews of the book like in different places. Like it's just there's
No.
just been so much conversation happening. Um Teenagers, like it's not really written for teenagers, it's more written for adults, but there's teenagers learning the book. There are like chaburas of women all around the world who just pick this book and they're all learning it together and discussing it. It's just really like I don't know. It's been very overwhelming because I didn't know how it would be perceived by people. So
Wow, that's really like, I guess, hopeful, right? Like people
yeah.
do want, they haven't given up on the topic. They just want a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like once people sometimes people are nervous to like read it because of their experience, but then once they read it, they're like pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I'm so excited to read it. Like
yeah,
I'm always looking for like a good book, and I love new perspectives on things. And I don't necessarily have like the worst relationship with tznius. I didn't grow up like keeping all of tznius. Um like let's say I wore short sleeves and short skirts, but my mother was very strict about like not wearing pants, which was like really, really hard for me as a kid, actually. I found that to be really like, why can I do this but not this as a kid, you know? So then as I got older and did keep more tznius, like it's hard because it's hard to the rules are hard to keep. And but at the same time, like I am somebody who works on more like the attitude of tznius, you know, and like even like to go back to the topic of intuitive eating, like I always say this to people, like it's normal that you want to look a certain way and like fit into a certain societal norm because we're
sure.
human, you know? So like
Mhm.
it is normal to relate to people via their body because like how do you know someone? How do you know how somebody is? It's based on how they look. If you walk into a store, you recognize your friend because of how they look, right? But obviously you get to know somebody at a much deeper level, totally unrelated to the way that they look. You know what I'm saying? But it's
For
like
sure.
it's a big part of who you are. But like we said before, it's like it's a means to an end, you know? Um,
Yeah, I think like just, it's hard to explain it in a nuanced way, like with the time we have. But I think what will be surprising to you about the book is that there's very few pages that have to do with your clothing choices. Like there's very, even in the halacha section, there's like, I think 2 pages that have to do with like the actual specifics of clothing.
right.
Like there's
Um,
actually a lot more to tznius and it's a much bigger topic. And I think people confuse like I don't even know the word for it, like image management, like how we look, how we want to
right,
project, how we, like it's all becomes part of tznius, but it's really two separate things, right? Like if I'm following halacha and I'm, a good person and I'm, acting tzniusly, right? Like, so who cares if I wear a blue skirt or a pink skirt, right? But like we've made so many of these details like so much a part of what it is and part of the conversation when really they don't even belong there.
right.
I don't know if it makes sense. I'm
No,
probably not explaining it clearly, but.
no, it does make sense. I totally understand what you're saying. It's like trying to separate like the halachic rules, like the halachic guidelines, with like what we've decided as a culture or community does fit into the like halachic guidelines of SNAS, let's say. I mean, I
Yeah.
literally can admit that I know nothing about this topic and I have no authority to
Yeah,
speak.
you'll have to read the book.
Yeah, but I did go to a share recently by Rebbe Weinberger from Ish Kodesh. Maybe it was not so recent, maybe within the last year or two. And it was she covered the midah of tznius. It wasn't really the halacha of tznius. And but then eventually she did talk about the halachos of tznius. And like I remember her saying, she went through the Gemara or the Shulchan Aruch, in terms of the halachos and um like like the first few, like she said, it goes in order of like importance, let's say. And the first few things that the Shulchan Aruch said had nothing to do with clothes, right? It had to do with like being knias at war, in attitude, right? We're talking about men, and then like much lower down on the list, it was like talking about potentially women making men sin. And it was like this like tiny little, how like it becomes like this huge thing, how like women make men sin by the way they dress. And it was like this tiny little blurb. I could be totally wrong. I'm saying it was a while ago. I don't really know about like so much about it, but I just remember she was really trying to emphasize that. She was trying to emphasize like think past like your 12-year-old self or what you learned in school. You know what I'm saying? That was what she was trying to emphasize.
Yeah,
Like
for sure.
there's so much that you have to relearn as an adult, like and with nuance, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So you know how like you know how you talk about diet culture a lot,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so like we've almost created this like sneeze culture where we talk about sneeze all the time in certain circles and we're talking about clothing and we're talking about, all these different things. So like just as diet culture is an invention, right? Like there was at some point like in history they didn't really have diets.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right? Like at
Yeah.
some point they just ate food
Right.
and it wasn't such a big deal. You know what I
Right.
mean? And
Yeah.
they actually wanted to eat food, right? Like it would be bizarre to not eat food because
Right.
like you would starve, right?
Yeah.
So just like with STIAS, it's kind of the same thing. Like the way we talk about it is almost like, I don't want to say an invention because some of it is based on earlier sources, but most of what we talk about nowadays, and we talk about SNEAS, like it didn't exist a couple hundred years ago. People
Right.
didn't have like they weren't going to the mall to buy clothes. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
They had
Totally.
like one dress. I don't know if
Right.
this is true. I mean, a historian will have to jump in and they have one dress they wore
No,
during the
it is
week,
true. I talk
one they
about
wore
this.
on
I
Shabbos.
talk about this in terms of diet culture
y-
that like
You
we didn't
know?
have mass produced clothes. We didn't have sizes. Everybody had
Right,
their own custom made quote unquote clothes. And we didn't
right.
have like, what's your size? What's my size? It was like, this is my body. This is your body. Like, no big deal, you know?
I don't think they had all these conversations because
Right.
their clothes were, they had one dress, it was pretty
Right.
modest. That's what everyone
Yeah.
wore in the Jewish and the non-Jewish world, and that was
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
like you see this actually reflected like in the halachic literature, meaning Chazal, when they talk about sneas, they're not talking about the clothing, like barely at all. They're talking about the midah of sneas, what you were referring to.
Right.
And then as you get like closer and closer to our time, you start seeing more and more people talking about it because it became a real issue at some point.
Right.
Because people in like the 1950s and 1960s, as like styles were changing,
Yeah.
people were like, oh wait, what do we do now? Because
Yeah.
they didn't have to worry about it.
Right.
I'm not saying it didn't ever come up or there were never issues, but when you look at the actual sources, like you could see it wasn't really a big issue like it is nowadays. And
Right.
that's why I was comparing it to diet culture. It's like we're
Right.
in this world that's all about clothing, all about externals. People are going shopping as like a national sport. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So every time they're going to the store, it's like, well, is this sneeze? Is that sneeze? Like it's become such a conversation. We have like, I mean, just think about 2025, right? We have like sneeze influencers and sneeze,
Right.
modest fashion magazines. Like this is all new. This didn't
Yeah.
exist,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So like I just think we're using the language. It's kind of like anachronistic where we're using the language from our time to think like that's how it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago or in the times of the Gemara. Like
Right.
it was just it was just different. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's why when you look at the actual like Chazal, the actual sources in the Torah for Sneas, the actual, in the Gemara, like they're just a very different conversation. It's almost confusing because you're like, wait, this is not what I think of as Sneas.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. I think that that is something that I think about a lot in terms of diet culture because, like, yeah, and I mean, in 2025, where you cannot have a conversation with somebody without mentioning what did you eat for breakfast? What did you eat for I mean, I do the same thing. I love talking about food, but I'm saying, like, I mean, really talking about dieting. Like, oh, I'm being so good today. I'm being so bad today. Like, but like, okay, yes, dieting has been around for sure in the 1950s and the 1960s, but before then, when food was scarce and there was no such thing as anorexia, you couldn't afford, you know what I'm saying? Like you ate what you afforded and that was it. There was no such thing
Exactly.
as restricting and trying to be skinnier and trying to be, you know. Um, and actually, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you, like, because we did connect a little bit a few weeks ago, we were emailing back and forth about a certain article that came out and I responded to the article. I know from that conversation, like a little bit about how you feel about intuitive eating, health at every size, but I wanted to hear a little bit about your background in it. Like, do you have a story? Do you have a history with, restrictive eating or body image or anything like that?
I think like I don't think I have like a unique, remarkable story. You know, like some people, like a friend of mine was actually on your podcast, Adina. She shared her story with you. It was really worth a listen if anyone didn't hear it yet. But like I don't feel like I have like a story. You know what I mean? Like I feel like I've just like evolved in a way in the way I think about these things. Like I definitely was raised with like a lot of diet culture. A lot of like just like I think just all of us. I was born in 86. Like I just think that was like the air
Yeah.
we
Mhm.
were breathing, like just
Yeah.
diet culture, weight, like all
Yeah.
this stuff. We talked about it all the time. We thought about it a lot, you know. And so something I was like very much immersed in to some degree. And then, you know, as I got older and I was exposed to like health at every size, intuitive eating, just as like a concept, it was like very, you know, eye-opening to me. And I think like just very slowly, I've been like integrating more of it. I've never like fully, you know, 100%. I
Yeah.
don't like, I don't think any of us do this 100%, but you
Yeah.
know, it's kind of been like an evolving process. I've read like a lot of books on the topic. I've thought about it a lot, you know.
Yeah.
Um, as a social worker and a continuing education provider, I do trainings on the topics for other mental health professionals because, you know, a lot of people in our field have never heard any of these concepts
Yeah.
before, which
Yeah.
is, you know, kind of scary, you know, because as a social worker, you work with people in every sort of body size, shape, whatever, right?
Mhm.
And like if you're not careful, you can actually really hurt people, even if you're well-meaning. And so that's something we've been working on a lot is like giving, you know, therapists, social workers like these tools to better understand like where they are with these things and how to make sure that they're creating like a safe space for their clients.
Mhm.
So that's been something I've been passionate about too.
So basically, like you, when you say like your story's not remarkable, but it's like typical, I guess you could say like
Typical.
everybody around you that was dieting or is dieting, and you were also dieting just because everybody else was dieting. Typical,
Yeah.
like normal dieting, I guess you could say.
Yeah, thank God, like no, nothing, you know, nothing clinical, I guess.
Yeah. And then
Just regular disordered eating, you know.
regular, like 90% of us. Um, it's funny when it's not funny at all. It's like so sad.
Yeah.
Um, so and then you're saying like you were casually introduced to intuitive eating, meaning like maybe you read about it in a mishpacha or whatever, or a friend
Yeah,
brought
it could be
you.
my friend Adina Meister who you had
Yeah,
on the like I
yeah,
talked to her a lot about these topics. She always lets me pick her brain. She taught me a lot, like different books. Yeah. I mean, it's very intuitive, no pun
yeah,
intended. So I think like
yeah,
anytime I heard these concepts, I listened to a few of your podcasts, I listened to like different things, you know, like it makes sense to me. So I think like, you know, it just stuck like the ideas in my, you know, they stuck in my head. I'm like, this makes sense, you know, and then like as I was learning more, it was kind of just
yeah.
reinforcing it. Yeah.
Funny though, because like we were talking a little bit before I started recording, and I was saying on my last podcast, I was talking about like burnout and like for a lot of people, I speak to a lot of people about this topic, right? And I would say like the majority of people I speak to say like they don't feel like what I'm saying is intuitive. They are horrified. They're horrified. The word is horrified. Like, what do you mean you could eat chocolate? Chocolate obviously is bad for you. Like it's bad. It's like dangerous, it's poison. A lot of
Sure.
like that. So like for many people, it's really not intuitive, It's
Yeah,
like,
no, I hear what you're saying actually. Like I do hear what you're saying. I think when you are raised that way, it is hard to break out of it. I think like, you know, I think about this a lot with even with this specifically, like with weight stigma, right? I think there's like two pieces to it. There's like changing how people believe, and then there's changing how people act.
right.
Okay. So meaning it's very hard to change the way someone believes. When
Yeah.
someone's been doing something for 50 years, 60 years, 70, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you change the way someone believes something? That's what you're getting, that horrified response of
Yeah.
like, there's no way. Like, I know you're wrong, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like, well, how do you change how people act? Okay. And the way you change how people act is that at some point it becomes socially unacceptable to say things, whether or not you believe them, right? And it's the same thing with racism, right? So, like, at some point it became unacceptable to say certain things about people who are of a different race. It's just not okay. And it
Right.
doesn't matter whether you believe that or not, you know that if you go out in the world, you don't say those things, right? And
Mhm.
so I think it's like a two-pronged approach to me. It's always like changing number one, how people act and what they say, and changing their beliefs. And like I just see with my personal experience that there's some people you're never going to change their beliefs, but
Right.
you can still change how they behave. And one of the ways you do that, and this is just my own personal experience, is not as an expert or anything, but is when you explain to someone like what you're saying really hurts people, or
Hmm.
like this really hurts me.
Hmm.
and explain why. And you say, this is something that's hurtful to me. I think that really changes people's behavior because they're still not going to understand, but nobody like wants to hurt someone, you know?
Hmm.
I mean, I'm sure there are people that it's very like it's hard to change behavior also. Like I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it's going to change
Right.
overnight, but I think like a lot of people like in this field and also in the social work field, I'm seeing this a lot with anti-Semitism and other things going on. It's like people are like, well, we have to change what people think. And I'm like, you could try and slowly you're going to change how people think, but that takes a lot of time.
Right.
And in the
Right.
meantime, we have to change how people speak and how they act. And that's why like the whole thing with the magazine article came up because I'm like, we can't change how every single person who reads a magazine thinks.
Yes.
That's a slow process.
Mhm.
But we can change when it's acceptable, like the types of ads that are acceptable in our magazines, the types of articles that are acceptable, the type of language that's acceptable. Like that's something that changes more quickly than changing the underlying beliefs. Does that make sense?
That is really like powerful what you just said, and I have to like write it down because I really appreciate what you just said. Because as I said this before we started recording, that over the years, let's say I've been doing intuitive eating as a professional for 6 years or 6+ years, let's say. And this experience is not unique to me. This is like I've heard this like almost across the board that the first like year or two, you're like so ready to tell everyone, whether you're doing it as a professional or not. You're just like, no, no, you don't have to diet. Like, come on. Like, I actually went over to somebody at the gym because she was talking to her friend about dieting, and I told her I'm a dietitian. And she's like, "Are you saying I need a dietitian?" She was so offended with what I said. I was like,
Really
"No."
trying to help.
I was like, "I read this book. I thought you would like it because I really like to me
Yeah.
so like eye opening." And like that happened for like a good year, maybe 2 years, and then I was just like, "Oh, people don't really want this. Most people don't really want this." And then you do start to feel a little bit burnt out because you're feeling so like dejected, like you don't want to hear this. Like this has been so life changing to me, and I think about it sometimes about like Bali Chuva, like people who become from, and I know that's not the same thing, but it's like their whole lifestyle has changed, and it's hard to be like to reintegrate into your normal life when you're like when your belief has changed so much, right? But what you're saying is, and I could use this as like a clinician and in my personal life, is that like, and I really believe this just from experience that like that's not really my job to change someone's belief. Even somebody who's paying me to try to help them, it's like I can never I say this a lot to clients. Like it's hard for me to change the way that I believe about people in larger bodies, even though like I know it in my
Right.
head that just because a person is X size doesn't mean they eat X way or it doesn't mean anything, right? But because of the way I've been raised and diet culture and the diet culture I'm still very much immersed in, even though I so consciously try not to, it's hard. It's like your psyche has been conditioned one way. So it's like I think that just like lets people like not off the hook, but like it lets them like relax a little bit and be like, I'm gonna teach you why this is hurtful, but I'm not gonna judge you if you can't make a belief shift because that's really hard to do.
Sure. Yeah. And just to give you a little more hope, like just talking about burnout and hope, I read something a few weeks ago and I'm like, it blew my mind. So I'm just going to share it because I think it'll really speak to what you do and even what we were talking about with the book before. Have you ever heard of the tipping point?
Yes, that's
Malcolm Gladwell?
Yeah, I
Okay.
actually quote him a lot. I think he's really brilliant at his stuff.
Yeah, he's really smart. So I didn't read The Tipping Point,
Read
but
it.
he just came out with a new book. It's called The Revenge of the Tipping Point, which I did read.
Okay.
And he says that basically, I think the number's 25%. He says that until you get to 25%, things go really, really, really slow, and then they just tip in like
Okay.
1 second. And he gives the example of gay marriage advocacy. And he
Okay.
basically says that before, like, if you look at where we are right now as a society and how acceptable that is, right?
Yeah.
He says, if you ask people in that space, like who are activists at the time, they would tell you there's never going to be a shift, there's never going to be a change. And this doesn't have to do with whether you're pro, con, whatever, but
Yeah.
just to understand like the whole concept here. He was saying like if you would ask people on the ground like 2 days before things shifted,
Yeah.
they would say they were so discouraged, so many things had happened. And he said what ended up actually making the shift was a TV show that like normalized it
Okay.
and it ended up like completely changing things and the whole world's different, right?
Yeah.
And his point was that it hit a certain point and then like it just went really quick.
Hmm.
And he gives many other examples. I think that one we all seen in our lifetime, that growing up, that was something like we didn't talk about, it wasn't acceptable. And then now we have all these laws protecting, those type of marriages, everything like that, right? So I think like we saw that shift in our own lives, how things just churn, right?
Yeah.
And that until it hits a certain point, it's very slow, it's very painful, and then all of a sudden smooth,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And so I think that that's what I feel like with intuitive eating. I feel like the conversations are happening, they are changing, but we haven't hit that point yet where like everybody's talking about it, where everybody gets it, where everybody understands it. But I feel like it's getting closer. And I
Okay.
feel like it's the same thing with like the SNES thing too. It's like I'm already seeing all the conversations shifting around me.
Hmm.
It's not 100%. Like there's still a lot of people saying things that, or maybe the ways we thought about before, things that are incorrect or misconceptions, right? But I
Yeah.
think like the goal in my head is like we just have to get to that 25%. We don't have to get to 100%. We don't need to change everybody's
Yeah.
minds on this
Yeah.
topic. But if we can get 25% of people to believe and act a little differently, it's going to like completely shift things for everybody else. And I really think about this again, like with the racism example, it's not that there's no racism anymore, but we know it's not acceptable, and I think like at some point it just clicked.
Right.
This is not okay anymore. Done.
Right.
And I think like that's happening, but while we're in it, it feels very challenging and hard.
Yeah. 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 No, first of all, I really appreciate that. I actually did write a blog post on one of Malcolm Gladwell's books. Which one was it? I can't remember. I'll have to send it to you after. Um, I really like him a lot. And it's funny that you say that about the tipping point because I read his book a while ago, so I have to take this book out from the library because I'm looking for good books. I'm really excited. Now I have your book and this book, so I'll have a really fun Shabbos. Um, but like one of the things he said that like I guess the tipping point stuck out to me was like email, like a few years ago when email came out, like it wasn't like a way of communication. And and now like we got so bombarded with email that people don't often like check their email because it became like it reached a tipping point. And that just like made sense to me because I'm just like um people used to like give away their email so easily and now they don't because they don't want to be
Yeah.
bombarded because it became
Right.
so easy to just send people emails as opposed to like,
Right.
you know,
Exactly.
real mail. Um, but that does it's like it's one of those things like as a therapist, let's say, or what I do as a dietitian, it's like they say like you have to protect yourself, like you have to have boundaries because like let's say like having the conversation with somebody about intuitive eating and health at every size. So somebody who's like receptive, for me at least, it's like very it's like how when like a creative is in flow, it's very like puts you in flow like
Yeah,
oh
for sure.
this person hears my idea, she agrees with me, or maybe she it's bothering her but she wants to hear more. And then there's like the combative or aggressive or like totally disrespectful person, or just like they even they're not trying to be disrespectful, they just don't get it. And you're just like like I need to not have this conversation, right? And like whereas, like I said before in the beginning, you think like you'll never get sick of talking about the topic that you're most passionate about. There has to be like a boundary because otherwise you could get so it could be so frustrating. It could totally take you out of flow. You know what I'm saying? So
Totally.
I appreciate that 25%. Christy Harrison is who's one of like the big intuitive eating people. She says this. She quotes this. I've heard her quote this line a lot. Like first they hate you, then they fight you, then they join you. Like something like that,
Exactly.
and like another quick example is like Evelyn Tribole, one of the authors of intuitive eating. she
Yeah.
she gives the example that like it used to be, I don't remember the exact details of this or when this was, but at a certain point in like hospitals people were like getting really sick and dying and nobody knew what it was, and it was because the doctors weren't wearing gloves or washing their hands.
Yeah.
And when somebody like brought that up, they were mocked and laughed at, and it was like that's not a thing. And now like you can't even fathom that people like doctors wouldn't wash their hands, right? So like for like that's I guess like the chizuk that I give myself when like I'm feeling like, you know what? No one's ever gonna like make the shift. Like, the 5% of like people in my life that like agree with what I'm doing. But it's not true because what you're saying is we're almost there. Like
Yeah,
there's
we really are.
conversations around it. It's just we're like a little bit stuck.
Yeah, I think we're almost there. Like I see people shifting, like I see people meaning like I'll give you like even like this is such a dumb example, but like people like do you comment if someone's pregnant or not, right? Like people are much less likely now to do that, right? Like
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
people it's very rare that someone will go up to someone and just be like, "Oh, are you pregnant?" Like
Right.
out of the blue, right?
Right.
But like 5 years ago that was totally normal. right? So like there's things that are shifting. We do see shifts. I think one of the other things that is important, like in these spaces where like there is a lot of burnout when like you're constantly having conversations with people, even like with me with the SNES thing, like there's so many times I'm talking to people and they just really don't get what I do. And it's just uncomfortable and
Yeah.
frustrating.
Yeah.
Um, or they say like, oh, I heard your book's great. I'm going to give it to someone else to read. Like, I don't need it because I'm good with this. And I'm like, then obviously you don't understand it because there's always
Yeah.
more to learn. And there's always,
Right. Yeah.
there's just these
I,
type of conversations that are frustrating is that really like sometimes I realized this a few weeks ago, sometimes we need to be in an echo chamber for a little bit. Like
right.
sometimes we need to sit with people who we don't have to explain things to, right? And we can use the word intuitive eating or health at every size and like they know exactly what we're talking about. And we
Yeah.
don't have to explain it and we don't have to fight. Like it's just like we can talk about best practices and have conversations and like there's such an energy because I had that experience with something else recently and I'm like there's such an energy. I was on a high like the day after. I was like it was about a different topic, but I was like I was just around people that get it.
Yeah.
Like how often do you get that time to be with people that like are on the same page as you? It's almost like, talking about politics. If you ever try to talk about politics with someone,
Yeah.
who's like who feels the opposite of you, it doesn't matter how you feel. It's just like
Yeah.
whatever the opposite is.
Yeah.
And like you realize somewhere you're like, we're talking different languages. Like we're
Right.
not communicating. Like we're trying our best, but like it's just not going because we're like we look at things so differently and we're using
Yeah.
even different words or we're using the
Right.
same words, but they mean different things. And like
Yeah.
it's so awkward. And then all of a sudden you're in the room with someone who has the exact same politics as you, right? About whatever topic, right? And it just like flows because like you say, Trump and they know you mean this and you say
Yeah.
this, then that means that. And
Yeah.
we're like all on the same page, right? And
Yeah.
like so I think like for those of us in places where we are getting that type of burnout, it's like so important to like also take out time to go to those. It sounds so bad to go to an echo chamber. It's like the opposite of what we do in our normal life. But like once in a while to go to like a little echo chamber just to re-energize, like be with
Yeah.
people that like speak our language.
100%. I mean, when you say the words like speak our language, like imagine being with someone who doesn't speak your language. It's very annoying. It's frustrating. And it's like when you find
Literally, yeah.
with someone in the same room as you who gets what you're saying, you're like, don't leave my side. Um,
Right.
yeah, I've totally been there. And I actually that's like something that I bring up with clients a lot is that like I ask them, do you have someone in your life that understands intuitive eating? One person.
One person.
And I've even tried to like buddy up clients and this I don't 100% agree with as advice, even though I give it as advice, is like the Facebook group, like intuitive eating in the firm world. I don't like that. Um, like that there's so much more nuance than in a Facebook group. That's the
Social
problem.
media is hard in general. Yeah.
Exactly. But like I find that clients who have that, like even one person, like you said, that you have Adina, they just do better because and I find that sometimes I have to call a friend and be like, do you know what someone who I'm really close with has just said to me? Like, how they told me how they lost 50
100%.
pounds in front of my kid. Like,
Yeah.
just like, and I'm just like, I love that person. Like, I don't want to be like the intuitive eating police, just like I don't want other people to be my diet police. Like, I really don't want
Exactly.
to be that person, even though just like somebody else might, when they say like chocolate is toxic, they really mean it. They're not trying to hurt anybody. But like for me, it is so that is so toxic. So it's like, okay, that person thinks what she's doing is healthy, and what I think what I'm doing is healthy, and we are not speaking the same language. So like, I like that's so important to me to like have mutual respect for other people's beliefs, but at the same time having like those like boundaries because like you could just I think different people are more prone to burnout, but like and maybe different topics are more prone to burnout. But I think
It's the
that
counterculturalness of it. You know what I mean? That's why the burnout comes. It's like because the message is not accepted 100% yet.
right, but wait, like just from what we said before about like that tipping point, like it does give me hope, and I think and it wasn't just that, like I really do have hope in this. Obviously, I wouldn't
And
continue.
of course you do, but I just
Yeah,
read that recently and I was like, this is so cool. Like I need to tell this
yeah.
to everybody. Yeah.
That is really something that you should tell to everybody. And I hope that a lot of people hear this and read that book. And I'm going to actually take that book out from the library. But okay, so we are going to have to wrap up because I have two kids coming home. First of all, I'll put the link to your book. Is your book, when the book is ready for sale, I'll put the link in the show notes in Hashem. Is there anything else that you wanted to leave the listeners off with before we end?
I just think like both these topics, they're so important. I think there's a lot of overlap, like just with the way we look at ourselves, the way we look at our bodies. There's a great intuitive eating book. It's called You Are Not a Before Picture. And I think just like the name of it is amazing.
Yeah,
But I think that's also applies to SNEAS, like
sure.
I think the quote from the book was, your body is the least interesting thing about you.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
It's that both in both these areas, it's really about, discovering our
her
inner
as a
selves
real
and our
person. Yeah,
internality and who we
yeah,
are as people and our values and like that deeper part of ourselves and like less of that focus on the external. And I think that helps us with our own self and our own self-image, but it also helps us in the way we relate to other people and be less judgmental of other people and less superficial. And yeah, I think we'll create a better world. And we just need 25% of people to
yeah.
get there, right? So
We're almost there, you and I together. Thank you so much for all your work and for coming on the podcast. I really, really enjoyed, and I'm so glad that we were able to make this work. And
you too.
we'll be in touch. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.